Every day the world spins on, stirring up events that either thrill or terrify us. And in those moments I crave stability, especially financial stability. And if you want that kind of security, you've got to work in a field where demand never fades and the paychecks stay healthy. That's why I decided to dive into IT, taking an online course from Skill Factory. In just 2 months, I got introduced to 9 hot areas in tech, from coding to cybersecurity. Then I picked the path that clicked with me and dug deeper. The best part? It was hands-on learning with real projects from big companies. By the end, I had a portfolio that actually got me interviews. Plus, the Career Center helped me land my first job. And here's the kicker. I could start learning now and pay nothing until 6 months later. With their New Year's promo code HISTORY, I even scored up to 60% off. A rare chance like that doesn't knock twice. But enough about me. I want to take you on a wild ride through the history of American presidents, told through the eyes of someone who's fascinated by the people behind the power. I'm talking about the legends, the scandals, the triumphs, and yes, even a few curses. Think of it as a tour from sleepy towns like Ashford to iconic places like Savannah, with characters named John, William, and Eleanor. People who shaped the nation in ways you never knew. Let's start at the beginning. Picture this. It's the spring of 1789, and George Washington, a tall, commanding figure with piercing blue eyes, stands on the steps of a modest house in Williamsburg. His uniform is crisp, polished boots gleaming in the sunlight, and a powdered wig framing a face carved by years of war and leadership. Washington wasn't just the first president. He was the man who made the job what it is today. But here's a fun fact. He never once lived in the White House. Nope, that iconic mansion wasn't ready yet, so he held court in ordinary homes, sipping on some seriously strong cider while juggling a fledgling nation's chaos. Now, if you think being president was all pomp and ceremony back then, think again. The country was barely stitched together. 13 colonies had declared independence from Britain in 1776, but for years after the war ended in 1783, they acted more like a group of squabbling neighbors than a united country. Imagine a block party where everyone's arguing over the playlist, and some want to bring their own snacks without sharing. Washington understood that without unity, the whole thing could fall apart. In fact, he once said, "Those who believe people can get by without government have far too high an opinion of human nature." Harsh, but true. Before Washington, there were presidents too, sort of. The Continental Congress had its own leaders with the title president, but they were more like chairmen of a very messy committee. Guys like Peyton Randolph and John Hancock did what they could, but real power was a distant dream. Washington was the first to hold the title with the kind of authority we associate with it today. And speaking of authority, Washington set a crucial precedent by stepping down after 2 terms. Back then, the idea of a president clinging to power like a toddler with a favorite toy was terrifying. So when he announced he wasn't running for a 3rd term, it was a big deal. Legend says it kept America from slipping into a monarchy, but some historians whisper that George was just plain exhausted. After all, leading a new country is no picnic, especially when your daily schedule looks like a marathon of meetings, negotiations, and whiskey rebellions. Ah, yes, the Whiskey Rebellion of 1791. Picture this. Washington, in his late 50s, dressed in a dark blue military coat with brass buttons shining, leather gloves on his hands, personally leading troops to put down a tax revolt in the backwoods of Pennsylvania. The rebels saw the man who had fought in the Revolution and instantly sobered up. Talk about a walk in the park. Since then, Americans have mostly left tax protests to the courts. Washington also left us some records. He's the only president ever to get 100% of the electoral votes. Talk about popularity. But despite that, his presidency was anything but easy. He laid the groundwork for the Supreme Court, set up the first national bank, and even started the Navy. Not bad for a guy who once joked he'd rather chop down a cherry tree than run a country. And just as Washington's era came to a close, a new figure emerged from the bustling streets of Boston. John Adams, a man as sharp as his tailored waistcoat and as intense as the powdered wig perched on his head. Adams was a scholar and a letter writer extraordinaire. During his presidency, he penned over 1,100 letters to his wife, Abigail, who was both his confidant and fiercest critic. Adams loved the British Constitution, probably because it gave him plenty to argue about, and he played a huge role in drafting the very documents that kept America ticking. But Adams' presidency was a roller coaster. The election that put him in office was the first modern political brawl. His rival, Thomas Jefferson, accused him of being a hermaphrodite importing British courtesans. Talk about low blows, while Adams promised Jefferson would burn the Bible and turn America into a French outpost. It was nastier than a reality TV reunion. The bitter rivalry gave birth to America's first political parties, the Federalists and the Republicans. Despite the drama, Adams had his moments. He built the White House and turned the Navy into a force to reckon with. But when Jefferson finally beat him in 1800, the baton passed to a man who would become one of America's most celebrated polymaths. This is where our story takes a turn. A man named Thomas Jefferson, whose interests ranged from architecture to paleontology. Imagine a tall, slender figure strolling through Monticello's gardens in linen trousers and a loose white shirt, his hair tied back with a simple ribbon, a thoughtful smile playing on his lips. Jefferson wasn't just president. He was a Renaissance man who doubled the country's size with the Louisiana Purchase and sent explorers Lewis and Clark on their epic journey west. But Jefferson's legacy isn't spotless. He wrestled with the contradictions of liberty and slavery, and his policies toward Native Americans were harsh, to say the least. He laid foundations, sure, but shadows stretched long over his tenure. And just as Jefferson's story concludes, a whisper of mystery creeps in. What really happened during those early years of the Republic? Were the Founding Fathers as united as history paints them? Or did hidden rivalries and secrets shape the nation's course? Stick around, because the next chapter will pull back the curtain on the untold stories that shook America's cradle. So buckle up, because this is just the beginning. The story of America's leaders is as colorful as their wardrobes, each with their own flair, their own flaws, and their own fights for power. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. The year was 1801 when Thomas Jefferson stepped into the Oval Office, a man whose style was as relaxed as his policies were revolutionary. Picture him arriving at Monticello, his sprawling estate nestled among the rolling hills of Virginia. Jefferson's attire was simple yet elegant. A linen shirt open at the collar, cream-colored breeches, and soft leather slippers that whispered against the wooden floors. His eyes sparkled with curiosity, and his smile held the charm of a man who believed knowledge could change the world. Jefferson was many things, an inventor, architect, philosopher, and even a bit of a flirt. Rumor had it he could charm the socks off any lady in Washington, and his smooth southern drawl only added to the effect. But beneath that easygoing exterior, he carried the weight of a nation expanding faster than anyone could have imagined. One of his biggest moves was the Louisiana Purchase, a deal so massive it doubled the size of the country overnight. Can you imagine? Buying a chunk of land so big it could fit a dozen Britons inside. Jefferson, ever the strategist, sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on an expedition to map out this new territory. Think of them as the original adventure vloggers, trekking through wild forests and across untamed rivers, their boots soaked and spirits high, sending back stories that would fuel America's manifest destiny. But Jefferson's presidency wasn't all exploration and expansion. He was a staunch believer in separating church and state, so much so that he coined the phrase, wall of separation. He wanted America to be a place where a man's faith was his own business, not government's. This stirred up quite the fuss among the more traditional folks who thought a country without a state religion was like tea without biscuits, just not proper. Now, Jefferson had a complicated relationship with slavery. He penned the Declaration of Independence, declaring, "All men are created equal," yet he owned hundreds of slaves himself. It's one of history's great ironies, and it haunted him like a shadow across his grand estate. His policies towards Native Americans were equally conflicted. He promoted assimilation but also backed expansion that pushed tribes off their lands. The man was a paradox, wrapped in powdered wig and philosophical musings. Meanwhile, across the ocean, tensions simmered. Britain, still smarting from losing the colonies, wasn't exactly thrilled with America's growth. Trade disputes escalated, and Jefferson found himself caught between protecting American interests and avoiding another costly war. His response? The Embargo Act of 1807, essentially slamming the door shut on all foreign trade. It was supposed to punish Britain and France, but ended up hurting American merchants more than anyone else. Imagine trying to run a business with no customers. Yeah, not fun. And then there was the personal side of Jefferson's life, which was just as dramatic as his political career. His relationship with Sally Hemings, one of his slaves, remains a topic of heated debate. Some say it was a love story twisted by the brutal reality of slavery. Others see it as a dark stain on his legacy. Either way, it adds layers to the man behind the presidency. In 1809, after 2 terms, Jefferson finally stepped down, leaving the stage to James Madison, his close friend and fellow Virginian. But just as Jefferson's chapter closed, a new drama was brewing, one that would test the young nation's resilience like never before. And here's a teaser. Beneath the surface of Madison's presidency lurked whispers of a second war with Britain, a conflict that would shake the very foundations of America. But that's a story for the next episode, where we'll meet characters who wore their military uniforms like badges of honor and faced enemies both abroad and at home. So, if you thought founding America was just about signing papers and giving speeches, think again. It was messy, complicated, and downright thrilling. Stay tuned, because the real fireworks are just getting started. When James Madison took the reins in 1809, he was a man who looked more like a scholarly professor than a wartime commander. Picture a slender figure, slightly stooped, with wisps of white hair escaping his powdered wig, round spectacles perched precariously on his nose, and a waistcoat that always seemed a size too small. Despite his unassuming appearance, Madison was a force to be reckoned with, known as the Father of the Constitution. He had helped craft the very framework of the country. But now his biggest test wasn't in writing laws, it was surviving a war. The War of 1812 might sound like a boring history lesson, but believe me, it was anything but. Imagine small towns like Concord and Salem being rattled by the distant thunder of cannon fire, while smoke curled over the horizon like the breath of a sleeping giant. Britain, still annoyed over trade disputes and America's growing independence, wasn't holding back. They blockaded ports, seized ships, and even burned down the White House in 1814. Yes, that happened. Picture the Grand Mansion engulfed in flames, its white walls blackened and crumbling, while President Madison and his wife Dolly fled just in time. Dolly, by the way, was a legend herself, known for her elegant gowns that swept the floor, pearls around her neck, and a charisma that could charm even the grumpiest congressman. Madison's war wasn't just about battles, it was also about identity. Could a nation that had fought so hard for independence really stand up again to the world's most powerful empire? The answer came with a resounding yes. American forces fought fiercely, and one of the war's most famous moments was the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, where General Andrew Jackson, a rugged frontiersman with a thick beard and a reputation for being as stubborn as a mule, led a ragtag army to a stunning victory, though the peace treaty had technically been signed weeks earlier. Talk about timing. But the war left scars. The economy was battered, and the country was divided between those who supported the fight and those who saw it as a foolish venture. Madison, always the thinker, struggled to keep the fragile Union together. He signed the charter for the Second Bank of the United States to stabilize the economy and backed infrastructure projects like roads and canals to connect the sprawling states. Yet, even as he worked to heal the nation, Madison's presidency paved the way for a new era of politics. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war, was fading fast, and the Democratic-Republican Party was splitting into factions. Enter the next player, James Monroe, a towering figure both literally and figuratively. Imagine a man with a square jaw, sharp blue eyes, and a cavalryman's posture, dressed in a dark green coat with brass buttons that caught the sunlight. Monroe's presidency would be the calm after the storm and the dawn of what's called the era of good feelings. But before we get there, here's a little twist. The War of 1812 wasn't just about battles and politics. It also sparked a strange legend that would haunt many presidents to come. The curse of Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a Native American leader who fought fiercely against American expansion. Legend has it that before he died, he cursed every president elected in a year divisible by 20, condemning them to an early death or a violent end. Spoiler alert, this curse would prove eerily accurate for a long time. So, as Madison's term ended in 1817 and the nation began to pick up the pieces, the seeds of future conflicts and mysteries were already being sown. The story is far from over, and the next chapter promises even more drama, intrigue, and characters who would define America's destiny. Ready for the next ride? Because the calm of Monroe's era is just the surface. Beneath it lurks political storms and secrets that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the early republic. James Monroe stepped into the presidential spotlight in 1817 like a seasoned actor taking the stage after a turbulent act. Standing tall with broad shoulders and a confident air, he carried the poise of a cavalry officer. His dark hair neatly combed, his crisp uniform adorned with gleaming brass buttons. Monroe hailed from a small town in Virginia, but his ambitions were anything but small. His presidency would soon be remembered as the era of good feelings, a time when Americans hoped the deep divisions of the past might finally fade. Monroe's charm wasn't just in his appearance, it was in his vision for a united nation. At a time when the scars of the War of 1812 still stung, Monroe preached national pride and expansion. He rode horses through the streets of Washington, often spotted wearing his signature high-collared coat and polished boots, projecting the image of a leader both accessible and commanding. One of his most famous moments came in 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine, a bold declaration that warned European powers to keep their hands off the Americas. Imagine Monroe standing tall in the White House's grand dining room, arms outstretched as he delivered a speech that would echo through history. It was America's way of saying, "This hemisphere is our backyard. You're not welcome here." It was less a threat and more a confident assertion of growing power. Think of it as the ultimate keep out sign. Monroe's presidency also saw the country swell with new states. Arkansas and Michigan joined the Union, bringing with them hopes, challenges, and plenty of political wrangling. The nation was stretching westward like a teenager who's grown too fast for their clothes, eager to explore but unsure of what lies ahead. But beneath the surface of this golden era, tensions simmered. The Democratic-Republican Party, once united under Jefferson and Madison, began to fracture. Political rivalries heated up and new factions formed, setting the stage for fierce battles over power and policy. Monroe himself was caught in the middle, trying to hold together a fragile peace between opposing forces. And then there was the personal side. Monroe's wife, Elizabeth, was known for her delicate beauty and impeccable taste. Picture her in flowing silk gowns, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off her pearl necklace, her smile gentle but firm, a perfect complement to her husband's robust presence. Yet, even as the nation seemed to bask in harmony, a shadow loomed. The issue of slavery, quietly tolerated but deeply divisive, was beginning to tear at the fabric of the Union. New states brought the question. Would they allow slavery or not? This question would ignite fierce debates and conflicts that no president could ignore. And here's where the mystery thickens. Around this time, strange rumors started swirling about secret meetings and whispered alliances, as if unseen hands were pulling strings behind the scenes. Some say these shadows belong to the old Federalists plotting a comeback. Others whisper of foreign agents stirring unrest. Whatever the truth, it was clear that Monroe's era of good feelings was more fragile than it appeared. So, as Monroe's second term wound down in 1825, the stage was set for the next drama, a presidential election so contentious it would shatter old alliances and reshape American politics forever. The players, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, men as different as chalk and cheese, each with their own ambitions and secrets. But before we dive into that, remember the curse of Tecumseh still lingers in the background, a dark thread weaving through the history of presidents to come. Will it strike again? We're about to find out. Get ready, because the next chapter will take us into the heart of political chaos, duels of words and pistols, and a story that's anything but good feelings. By the time the 1824 election rolled around, the political stage was set for a showdown worthy of a Shakespearean drama. On one side stood John Quincy Adams, a tall, slender man with sharp features, always impeccably dressed in dark waistcoats and silk cravats, his silver hair neatly combed back. Adams carried the weight of a political dynasty. His father had been president, and he himself was a seasoned diplomat, fluent in multiple languages. On the other side was Andrew Jackson, a rugged frontiersman from Tennessee, broad-shouldered and weathered by years of battle. His attire was a sharp contrast to Adams's polished look, rough leather boots, a worn leather jacket, and a glare that could make even the toughest soldier think twice. The election was a mess. No candidate won a majority in the Electoral College, so the decision went to the House of Representatives. Adams, known for his intellect and diplomacy, struck a deal with Henry Clay, the powerful Speaker of the House, one that would later be called the corrupt bargain. When Adams won the presidency, Jackson and his supporters erupted in fury, accusing them of backroom deals and betrayal. The political mudslinging that followed made today's Twitter feuds look like polite tea parties. Adams's presidency was marked by ambition and vision. He dreamed of building canals, roads, and schools to knit the nation together. He held elaborate receptions in the White House, where ladies in flowing silk gowns, delicate gloves, and sparkling tiaras mingled with poets, scientists, and politicians. Adams himself was a man of refined tastes, often seen holding a book or a quill, his eyes shining with ideas yet to be realized. But his vision came at a cost. Congress resisted his plans, and public opinion was divided. Many saw Adams as aloof and out of touch, a man more comfortable in salons than on the rough frontier. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson was gaining popularity as the champion of the common man, a war hero who had spent years fighting Native American tribes and the British. Jackson's fiery temper and no-nonsense style made him a polarizing figure. He survived 12 duels, was once shot in the chest, and even famously beat a would-be assassin with his cane. His rough-hewn charisma and tales of frontier grit resonated with many voters who felt left behind by the elites in Washington. The tension between Adams and Jackson was more than politics. It was a battle for America's soul. Would the country embrace the polished intellectual leadership of Adams or the raw populist energy of Jackson? The answer came in the next election, where Jackson would storm into office like a thunderclap. But before that, there's a twist. Adams' presidency wasn't just about politics. In 1825, the Erie Canal was completed, transforming New York and turning small towns into booming trade hubs. Imagine barges laden with goods winding through the waterway, townsfolk in straw hats and suspenders cheering as the canal boats passed. It was a glimpse of America's future, industrial, connected, and unstoppable. Yet, behind these achievements, the dark question of slavery and Native American displacement grew louder. Jackson, for all his populist appeal, championed policies that would displace thousands of Native Americans along the Trail of Tears, a brutal chapter that would stain his legacy forever. And as this political saga unfolded, the curse of Tecumseh loomed nearer. The year 1828 was divisible by 20, and Andrew Jackson's election would mark another test for the mysterious curse that had haunted presidents since the early days. So buckle up. The next chapter will plunge us into a whirlwind of political battles, personal vendettas, and a presidency that would change America forever. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And trust me, there's no shortage of drama when Andrew Jackson takes the stage. The year was 1829, and Andrew Jackson strode into the White House like a man who'd just won a prize fight. Boots dusty from the frontier, a weathered leather coat thrown over broad shoulders, and a glare sharp enough to cut glass. At 62, Jackson wasn't your typical polished politician. He was a rugged, relentless force of nature, with a thick beard that framed a face hardened by years of battle and loss. His piercing gray eyes burned with determination beneath bushy eyebrows, and his hands, calloused from wielding swords and pistols, gripped the reins of power with a grip as firm as his will. Jackson's inauguration was a spectacle unlike any before it. The gates of the White House were flung open to the public, and thousands of supporters, mostly common folk in worn hats, simple dresses, and muddy boots, poured in, turning the stately mansion into a raucous party. Reportedly, the crowd got so rowdy that the furniture was damaged and servants fled in panic. It was an early lesson that Jackson's presidency would be anything but tame. From day one, Jackson set out to shake up Washington's elite. He despised the entrenched political classes and vowed to give power back to the common man. His cabinet, famously dubbed the Kitchen Cabinet, was made up of trusted friends and loyalists rather than seasoned politicians. Picture informal meetings in the White House kitchen over strong coffee and cigars, where decisions were made away from the prying eyes of the establishment. But Jackson's approach wasn't just about friendship. It was ruthless. He wielded the presidential veto like a hammer, blocking legislation he didn't like with a booming "no" that echoed through the halls of Congress. His battle against the Second Bank of the United States was legendary. Jackson viewed the bank as a corrupt institution that favored the wealthy elite over ordinary Americans. With a dramatic flourish, he vetoed its recharter and withdrew federal funds, sending shockwaves through the economy and politics alike. Yet Jackson's presidency was marred by darker deeds. His enforcement of the Indian Removal Act led to the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands, an event now remembered as the Trail of Tears. Imagine families wrapped in tattered blankets, trudging through snow and rain, their spirits crushed but their resolve unbroken. Jackson, with his steely gaze and unyielding stance, justified the policy as necessary for American expansion. but history judges it as a grave injustice. On the personal front, Jackson was a man of contradictions. He was fiercely loyal to his wife, Rachel, whose health suffered under the strain of political attacks and scandal. Rachel, known for her elegant yet modest gowns, soft brown curls pinned neatly, and a gentle smile that masked her inner turmoil, died shortly after Jackson took office. His grief was profound, fueling his fiery temper and relentless drive. Jackson's presidency also saw dramatic moments like the nullification crisis, where South Carolina threatened to defy federal tariffs. Jackson, ever the tough guy, threatened military action to preserve the Union, but also sought compromise, showing a balance of force and diplomacy. And through it all, the curse of Tecumseh hung over him, a reminder that presidents elected in years, divisible by 20, faced peril. Jackson survived 12 assassination attempts, once famously beating a would-be assassin with his cane. Talk about fighting spirit. As Jackson's tumultuous first term rolled on, the nation was changing faster than ever. The frontier was closing in, cities were booming, and politics was becoming a spectacle of mass rallies and fiery speeches. Jackson had ignited a new era of democracy, but at a cost that would ripple through generations. And just when you think the drama couldn't get any thicker, a whisper of scandal and secret societies begins to surface, hinting at forces beyond the public eye pulling strings in Washington. What dark alliances are brewing? Who's really calling the shots? The next chapter promises even more intrigue, betrayal, and battles. Not just for power, but for the soul of a nation. Stay close. The story is far from over. By the time Martin Van Buren took over the presidency in 1837, Washington felt like a circus on the edge of chaos. Picture Van Buren as a slender, sharp-featured man with a slicked-back mane of auburn hair, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits and polished boots, his eyes gleaming with political cunning. Known as the Little Magician for his skill behind the scenes, Van Buren was the mastermind who had helped build Andrew Jackson's political machine. Now it was his turn to steer the ship. But Van Buren's presidency kicked off under a dark cloud. The Panic of 1837. Imagine crowds of desperate farmers and factory workers in muddy boots and worn-out coats, lining up at banks only to find their accounts frozen and savings vanished. The economy collapsed, businesses shuttered, and unemployment soared. Van Buren, despite his calm demeanor and eloquent speeches, was powerless to stop the storm. His attempts to ease the crisis, including establishing an independent treasury, were met with skepticism and frustration. While the country struggled, Van Buren's personal life seemed a world apart. His wife, Hannah, was known for her demure charm and simple elegance, always seen in modest dresses with delicate lace collars and neat bonnets. She was a steady presence through the political turmoil, hosting quiet gatherings that contrasted sharply with the raucous crowds that packed the streets outside. Van Buren's political style was all about balance and caution. Unlike Jackson's fiery outbursts, he preferred to work quietly behind the scenes, pulling strings and making deals. But the divisions in the country were widening, slavery debates intensified, and new political factions began to emerge. The Whig Party, a coalition of Jackson's opponents, was gaining strength, promising a return to more traditional leadership. And then there was the Texas question. Texas had declared independence from Mexico in 1836, and many Americans wanted to annex it. Van Buren, aware of the delicate balance between slave and free states, hesitated. Annexing Texas threatened to upset that balance and risk war with Mexico. His cautious stance cost him politically, as expansionist sentiment swelled. Van Buren's presidency also had its share of personal drama. Rumors swirled about secret societies and political conspiracies, whispers of shadowy figures influencing decisions from behind closed doors. Some even claimed Van Buren was involved in clandestine meetings with foreign agents, though nothing was ever proven. It added an air of mystery to an already turbulent time. Despite his efforts, Van Buren lost the 1840 election to William Henry Harrison, a war hero with a booming voice and a knack for showmanship. Harrison's campaign was a spectacle of log cabins and hard cider, painting Van Buren as an out-of-touch elite. The election was a turning point, ushering in a new era where image and populism ruled the day. But Harrison's victory was short-lived. Just a month after his inauguration, he died of pneumonia, making his vice president, John Tyler, the first president to assume office without being elected. Tyler, a tall, lean man with sharp features and a mischievous grin, brought his own brand of controversy. Known for his wit and stubbornness, Tyler clashed with Congress and even faced threats of impeachment. Tyler, who fathered 15 children, yes, 15, was a man who truly kept life interesting. His personal charm and eccentricities made him a figure both loved and loathed. He called himself His Accidency, poking fun at his unexpected rise to power. As Van Buren's era faded, the country teetered on the brink of sectional conflict. The stage was set for battles over territory, slavery, and the very definition of America. And lurking in the background, the curse of Tecumseh waited patiently for its next victim. Next time, we'll dive into the explosive years of territorial expansion, political upheaval, and presidents whose legacies are as tangled as the frontier itself. Until then, keep your eyes open, because history often hides its darkest secrets in plain sight. The year was 1844, and the nation was riding a wave of expansionist fever. Enter James K. Polk, a man of modest stature but towering ambition. Picture a lean figure with sharp features framed by dark, slicked-back hair, dressed in a simple black frock coat and a crisp white shirt, his piercing eyes fixed on the horizon. Polk was the kind of guy who looked like he belonged in a law office, but had the heart of a frontiersman ready to wrestle the wild. Polk's presidency was all about manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to stretch from sea to shining sea. From day one, he set out to make that vision a reality. His agenda was tight and focused. Annex Texas, acquire Oregon, and push the country's borders westward. He was so efficient that historians jokingly call him the first workaholic president. Imagine a man who kept such detailed daily schedules that even his enemies admired his discipline. The annexation of Texas was a fiery issue. Texans had declared independence from Mexico years earlier, but their bid to join the Union sparked outrage in Mexico, setting the stage for war. Polk, undeterred, pushed Congress to approve the annexation, knowing full well it could lead to conflict, and conflict it did. In 1846, the Mexican-American War erupted. Picture the battlefields, dusty plains under a blistering sun, soldiers in blue and gray uniforms clashing with Mexican cavalry, the air thick with gunpowder and sweat. Polk, though never a soldier himself, was a master strategist, overseeing campaigns that added California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of several other states to America's growing map. The country's borders swelled as if someone had hit the expand button on a map. But Polk's presidency wasn't without controversy. The war with Mexico was criticized by many as an act of aggression, a land grab at the expense of a weaker neighbor. Domestically, the expansion reignited fierce debates over the extension of slavery into new territories, a combustible issue that would later ignite the Civil War. On the home front, Polk was a private man. His wife, Sarah, was known for her refined Southern grace, always appearing in elegant dresses of silk and lace, her auburn hair pinned up with delicate combs, her demeanor calm yet commanding. Sarah was Polk's confidant and advisor, navigating the treacherous waters of Washington society with poise. Polk's single term was intense and transformative, but he chose not to seek re-election, famously declaring he would serve only one term. He left office exhausted, and just a few months later, he died at his home in Tennessee, a man who had reshaped the nation but never lived to see the full consequences of his decisions. Meanwhile, the nation's political landscape was shifting rapidly. The Whig Party, which had opposed Polk's aggressive expansionism, was fracturing, and new parties were emerging, fueled by growing tensions over slavery and immigration. And lurking beneath all this was the ever-present curse of Tecumseh. Polk was elected in 1844, another year divisible by 20, and although he escaped an untimely death, the shadow of the curse seemed to hang over his successors. As Polk's era closed, the country stood on the brink of upheaval. The next presidents would face challenges that tested the very soul of America, questions of union and division, of freedom and bondage, of power and principle. In the next chapter, we'll meet leaders whose actions pushed the nation toward crisis and whose personal stories are as riveting as their political battles. Stay tuned, because the road to the Civil War is as winding as it is unforgettable. By 1850, the United States was a nation on edge, teetering between hope and turmoil. Millard Fillmore had stepped into the presidency following the sudden death of Zachary Taylor, a rough-and-ready war hero who'd barely settled into the White House before illness claimed him. Fillmore, a man of medium build with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, was a contrast to Taylor's ruggedness. He dressed with quiet dignity, dark frock coats, starched collars, and silk cravats, and carried himself with the calm assurance of a seasoned statesman. Fillmore's presidency was dominated by one overwhelming crisis: how to hold the fractured nation together. The debates over slavery's expansion into new territories had torn the country apart, and Fillmore stepped in during a moment when passions threatened to boil over. He signed the Compromise of 1850, a series of laws designed to ease tensions. Among these were the controversial Fugitive Slave Act, which mandated that escaped slaves be returned to their owners, even in free states, a law that sparked outrage and resistance in the North. Imagine the tense dinners in Washington's parlors, where ladies in modest yet elegant gowns clutched their fans tightly, whispering about the latest political uproar. Men in tailored suits argued heatedly over the future of the Union, their voices low but fierce. Fillmore, ever the pragmatist, sought to keep the peace, but many saw him as a man caught between worlds, unable to satisfy either side. On the personal side, Fillmore was a devoted husband to his wife Abigail, who was known for her gentle nature and simple fashion, soft pastel dresses with lace trims, and a penchant for delicate pearl earrings. Together they navigated the turbulent waters of politics, their partnership a quiet beacon amid the storm. Fillmore's enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act made him deeply unpopular in the North and split the Whig Party, hastening its decline. The country's political landscape was fracturing, with new movements like the Free Soil and Republican parties rising, fueled by opposition to slavery's expansion. As tensions escalated, the nation inched closer to conflict. The question wasn't just about land or laws. It was about identity, rights, and the very meaning of freedom. The stage was set for men like Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, whose presidencies would be marked by indecision and controversy, and who struggled to prevent the inevitable storm. And of course, the curse of Tecumseh lingered in the background. Pierce was elected in 1852, Buchanan in 1856, both years divisible by 20. And while the curse didn't claim their lives, their terms were marred by turmoil that hastened the nation's descent toward civil war. As the 1850s roared on, the cracks in America's foundation widened. The next chapter will plunge us into the chaos and heartbreak of a nation divided, where presidents wrestled with moral dilemmas and political earthquakes that reshaped history. Get ready for a story of ambition, tragedy, and the fight for a country's soul, because the storm is coming and it will change everything. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln emerged from Springfield, Illinois, stepping onto the national stage with a tall, lean frame, clad in a simple black frock coat, and his trademark stovepipe hat perched atop unruly dark hair. His face, marked by deep lines and a solemn gaze, carried the weight of a nation on the brink of collapse. Lincoln was a man of humble origins, a self-taught lawyer whose quiet determination masked a sharp wit and profound empathy. The country was fracturing like a cracked mirror. 11 southern states had already declared their secession, forming the Confederacy, and the Civil War was looming. Lincoln's election, in a year divisible by 20, 1860, seemed to fulfill the ominous curse of Tecumseh. Yet he was determined to hold the Union together at any cost. His speeches stirred the hearts of millions. Imagine Lincoln standing tall in the chilly air at Gettysburg, the crowd wrapped in woolen coats and scarves, hanging on every word of his Gettysburg Address, a mere 272 words that would echo through history. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln's presidency was a crucible of pain and perseverance. He bore the loss of loved ones, including his beloved wife Mary Todd, often dressed in somber black silk gowns, her eyes reflecting the anguish of a nation divided. His own tall silhouette was a constant fixture in the war-torn White House, pacing late into the night, wrestling with decisions that cost thousands their lives. Despite the horrors of war, Lincoln championed the cause of freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 declared all slaves in Confederate-held territory free, a bold move that redefined the nation's purpose. Yet, Lincoln's vision extended beyond abolition. He dreamed of a reunited country, healed and whole. Tragedy struck on a cold April night in 1865 when Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer at Ford's Theater. The nation mourned as Lincoln's tall, stoic figure was laid to rest, his legacy forever etched in the annals of history. But even as the Civil War ended, new challenges arose. Reconstruction tested the country's resolve to rebuild and redefine itself. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, a fiery Tennessee politician known for his rough speech and stubborn nature, struggled to navigate the fractured landscape, his policies sparking fierce debate. The curse of Tecumseh, though long debated, seemed to cast a shadow over these turbulent times, but Lincoln's legacy endured as a beacon of hope and unity. As we close this chapter of American history, remember that the story of its leaders is not just about politics and power. It's about the human spirit, frailty, and the relentless pursuit of a better future. Yet, whispers remain of mysteries yet unsolved, secret dealings, forgotten letters, and untold stories lurking in the shadows of history. What hidden truths lie beneath the surface of the nation's founding? What legacies have been lost or covered up? The journey doesn't end here. History is alive, waiting for those curious enough to uncover its deepest secrets. Thank you for joining me on this ride through time. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning.